All right, so we're diving into something that sounds like it's straight out of a spy thriller, but unfortunately, it's all too real.
Yeah, the U.S. intelligence community's 2024 threat assessment, we're talking about the declassified version, of course.
Of course, we're not going to go all Edward Snowden on you.
But let's just say this report doesn't exactly paint a rosy picture of the future.
Our mission, should we choose to accept it, is to break down this massive document and give you the need-to-know highlights.
Consider it your crash course on global security. Just enough to impress at your next cocktail party.
Exactly. So the report kicks off with this phrase, a fragile world order, which, let's be honest, sounds a little ominous.
It is. You've got major powers like China and Russia engaged in this high-stakes competition for influence.
Like a global chess match where the stakes are incredibly high.
And then, just to keep things interesting, you've got these simmering regional conflicts that have the potential to drag everyone into the fray.
Like we saw recently in Gaza, which reminds us that even conflicts that seem far away can have ripple effects across the globe.
And of course, we can't forget about the wild card in all of this, climate change.
Right, because as if things weren't complicated enough, climate change acts as this, threat multiplier.
Exactly. It exacerbates existing tensions, creates new ones, droughts, floods, resource scarcity.
All ingredients for instability and conflict.
And that brings us to one of the key takeaways from the report. It's not just about military might anymore.
It's this complex web of interconnected challenges that are becoming increasingly difficult to untangle.
And when you look at the specific threats outlined in the report, there's one country that really stands out.
Let me guess. China.
Bingo.
The report doesn't mince words. It basically says China is the top contender looking to displace the U.S. as the world's leading power.
And they're not just talking the talk, they're walking the walk.
So what's their strategy?
Well, the report details a multi-pronged approach. They're flexing their economic muscles through things like trade deals and investments.
Right, and we can't forget about their massive military modernization program.
They're developing hypersonic missiles, expanding their navy, and, perhaps most concerningly, rapidly building up their nuclear arsenal.
I was just going to say, what about their nukes? Because last I checked, they were lagging behind the U.S. in that department.
Not anymore. The report indicates that China has been busy constructing hundreds of new missile silos.
Hundreds? Seriously?
Hundreds.
Okay, that's not exactly what I would call reassuring.
No, it's a game changer. It signifies a major shift in the global balance of power.
So what's the motivation behind this massive buildup? Are they going for a peace through superior firepower strategy?
That's the million-dollar question, and frankly, it has intelligence analysts scratching their heads.
So no one really knows for sure.
Some believe it's primarily about deterrence. They want to project an image of strength to discourage any potential adversaries.
Makes sense. Kind of like, don't even think about messing with us, we've got nukes for days.
Exactly. But others suggest it goes beyond deterrence, that China is aiming for a position of global dominance.
So they want to call the shots, set the rules of the game.
Precisely. And that has much broader implications for the global order.
Not exactly comforting, is it?
Not really. It injects a whole new level of uncertainty and risk into an already volatile geopolitical landscape.
Yeah, fragile peace at best, right?
Right.
It's like we're entering this new Cold War, but instead of just nukes, it's about who can control the future of, well, pretty much everything.
And that brings us to another area where China is really pushing the envelope. Artificial intelligence.
Right. The report goes deep on this, and it's not just about AI making our smartphones a little bit smarter.
No, not at all.
This is about using AI to, reshape warfare.
Exactly. They're talking about AI-driven weapon systems that could fundamentally alter the balance of power.
So you're talking about autonomous drones that can make their own combat decisions.
Or missiles that can change course in mid-flight based on real-time data analysis. It's pretty mind-blowing, to be honest.
Right. It's like something out of the Terminator. But instead of Arnold Schwarzenegger, it's like an algorithm calling the shots.
And that's where things get a little unnerving, right? I mean, what happens if an AI misinterprets data and triggers a conflict?
Or what about the lack of accountability if an autonomous weapon causes civilian casualties? Who's to blame in that scenario?
Those are the million-dollar questions, and honestly, I don't think we have the answers yet.
Yeah, it's like we're trying to write the rule book for a game that's already being played.
Right, and at a speed that's hard to keep up with.
And it's not just about weapon systems, is it? The report also mentions China using AI for, cyber warfare and spreading propaganda.
Exactly. AI can be used to create these incredibly sophisticated hacking tools that can infiltrate networks, disrupt critical infrastructure.
And then there's the whole propaganda angle, which is just as insidious, if not more so.
AI-powered tools can spread misinformation, manipulate public opinion, and sow discord on a scale we've never seen before.
It's like the digital equivalent of psychological warfare.
Except instead of leaflets and radio broadcasts, we're talking about targeted social media campaigns and deepfakes that are almost impossible to detect.
It's like a recipe for chaos. And the report makes it clear that this isn't just some hypothetical threat, it's happening right now.
It is.
Okay, so we've got China investing heavily in AI, both for military purposes and for, messing with our minds.
Right, and it's important to note that this isn't just a China problem.
Oh, right, because Russia's been dabbling in the dark arts of cyber warfare and disinformation for a while now.
Exactly, and the report suggests they're becoming even more reliant on these tactics, especially after their setbacks in Ukraine.
So they're adapting, finding new ways to achieve their objectives without resorting to a full-scale military confrontation.
They're relying on cyber warfare, disinformation campaigns, and even private military companies like the Wagner Group to exert influence and undermine Western interests.
Speaking of the Wagner Group, the report confirms that Iran is behind those recent attacks on U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria.
Right, they're using these proxy groups to target American interests without directly engaging in a full-blown conflict.
So it's like they're trying to provoke the U.S., but avoid a direct confrontation.
It's a dangerous game, to be sure.
Because it seems like it could easily spiral out of control.
It could, and the report highlights another potential flashpoint that has experts on edge. North Korea.
Ah, yes. Kim Jong-un and his ever-expanding collection of ballistic missiles.
Well, he's added a new toy to his arsenal. A ballistic missile submarine.
Wait, you mean a submarine that can launch nuclear missiles?
The one and only.
Okay, now that's just terrifying.
It's a game changer, no doubt about it.
So explain it to me like I'm 5. Why are these submarines such a big deal?
Well, ballistic missile submarines, or boomers as they're often called, are incredibly difficult to track and target.
So they could potentially launch a surprise attack without any warning.
That's the idea. It's what makes them such an effective deterrent, but it also raises the stakes significantly.
Because if you think a country like North Korea is unpredictable now, imagine giving them the ability to launch a nuclear strike from anywhere in the world.
Exactly. It introduces a whole new level of uncertainty and risk into an already volatile region.
Okay, so we've got China building up its nuclear arsenal, investing heavily in AI for both military and propaganda purposes, and Iran and North Korea flexing their muscles in their respective regions.
And we haven't even touched on some of the transnational threats that are becoming increasingly difficult to contain.
Like the fentanyl trade, which, according to the report, is being fueled by, you guessed it, China.
Right. It seems China is the common thread in many of these global challenges.
It's like they're playing 3D chess while the rest of us are trying to figure out checkers.
Something like that.
The report reveals that much of the equipment and precursor chemicals used to manufacture fentanyl are coming from China.
Despite their claims of cracking down on the trade.
It's a stark reminder that economic interests often trump ethical considerations, even when it comes to a deadly epidemic like the fentanyl crisis.
Sadly, that seems to be the case more often than not.
But perhaps the most insidious threat outlined in the report is one that doesn't always grab headlines, but is no less concerning.
You're talking about digital authoritarianism.
Exactly.
It's a growing concern, and it's not just about governments spying on their own citizens. It's about using technology to control information, suppress dissent, and manipulate behavior on a societal scale.
Right. We touched on China's social credit system earlier, but the report suggests that this is just the tip of the iceberg.
Exactly. We're seeing similar tactics being employed by governments around the world, many of them embracing authoritarian values.
And they're often doing it with the help of technology and expertise provided by, surprise, surprise, China.
It's a troubling trend, to say the least.
Okay, so let's zoom in on this whole digital authoritarianism thing for a second. It sounds incredibly dystopian, but I think a lot of people still don't fully grasp how it actually plays out in the real world.
Right. It's easy to dismiss it as something that only happens in other countries, but the reality is it's closer home than we might think.
So give us some concrete examples. How is this digital authoritarianism manifesting itself?
Well, take those overseas police stations that have been in the news recently. These are essentially outposts set up by authoritarian governments, often disguised as cultural centers or businesses, to monitor and intimidate dissidents living abroad.
We've heard reports of these operating in Canada, the U.S., and several European countries.
Exactly. And it's incredibly brazen. They're essentially extending their reach across borders to silence critics and stifle free speech.
It's a chilling thought, and it really highlights the transnational nature of these threats.
It does, and it's not just about physical intimidation either.
Right, because we're also seeing the widespread use of things like facial recognition technology for surveillance purposes.
Exactly, and often without adequate privacy safeguards.
It's like something out of a science fiction novel, but it's happening right now.
It is, and the technology is only getting more sophisticated.
Which is a terrifying thought.
It is, and it's not just governments that have access to these tools anymore.
You're saying that criminal organizations could get their hands on this technology?
I am, and that's a deeply concerning thought.
Because we're talking about powerful surveillance technologies that can be used to target individuals, suppress dissent, and erode fundamental freedoms.
And it's often done gradually, under the guise of national security or public safety.
So by the time people realize the full extent of the intrusion, it's too late to do anything about it.
Exactly. It's a slippery slope.
So what can we do about it? Yeah, I mean, short of throwing our smartphones in the ocean and living off the grid, how do we fight back against this digital overreach?
Well, I wouldn't recommend going full Luddite just yet.
Okay, good, because I'm not quite ready to give up my Spotify playlist.
But you're right, it's a challenge, and there are no easy answers.
So where do we even begin?
I think it starts with awareness.
So, knowledge is power, as they say.
Precisely. We need to educate ourselves and others about the potential dangers of these technologies and the importance of protecting our digital privacy and freedoms.
It's almost like we're on this conveyor belt, being pulled towards this future where our every move is tracked and analyzed, both online and offline.
And the scary part is the technology is advancing so rapidly.
Yeah, like facial recognition software, it's gotten incredibly sophisticated, right?
Oh, absolutely. It can identify individuals in crowds, even if they're trying to hide their faces. It's remarkable, and not always in a good way.
So much for anonymity in the digital age, right?
Right, and it plays into this larger trend we've been talking about, digital authoritarianism, like with China's social credit system, for example.
Where you get a score based on your behavior, your online activity, and that score can affect everything from getting a loan to even getting a job.
Exactly. It's like a digital rating system for your entire life.
And what's even more concerning is that this kind of social scoring isn't limited to countries like China anymore.
You're right. We're seeing elements of it pop up in other parts of the world, often disguised as personalized marketing or targeted advertising.
It's like a slippery slope. Where does personalized marketing end and manipulation begin,
Exactly. It's a question we need to be asking ourselves right now.
Absolutely. So we've painted a pretty bleak picture here. We've got geopolitical tensions, emerging technologies with potentially scary consequences, and the rise of digital authoritarianism. Is there any room for optimism in this picture?
Well, I'm a firm believer that even in the darkest of times, there's always hope.
Okay, so where does that hope come from?
I think it starts with awareness. We need to educate ourselves and others about the potential risks of these trends, and then we need to act on that knowledge.
So it's not enough to just be informed. We have to actually do something with that information.
Exactly. We need to become more discerning consumers of information, more critical of what we see and hear online, and we need to demand greater transparency from our elected officials in these tech companies.
And we need to support those organizations that are fighting to protect our digital rights.
Absolutely, because if we don't stand up for these values now, we risk losing them altogether.
And that's a future none of us want to see.
Agreed. The future is uncertain, but it's not set in stone. We all have a role to play in shaping it.
Well said. And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the U.S. intelligence community's 2024 threat assessment.
It's been a fascinating, if somewhat sobering, conversation.
It has, but hopefully our listeners are now a little more informed and maybe even a little more motivated to engage in these important conversations.
Because in a world facing unprecedented challenges, knowledge truly is power.
That's right. So stay informed, stay engaged, and most importantly, stay curious. Until next time, this has been The Deep Dive.